Okay, we're back. So we left off talking about the current state of the Church of England, and again, as religious groups tend to do, they split yet again. The independents split into two main, I guess, factions, you could say. What we know now is the Presbyterians. They're still around. They strongly believed in the need for a national church. They did not have an issue with that. They thought that needed to be a unifying force for the church. And the only difference between the Presbyterians and, I guess, the high church members who were, more kind of Catholic light, they wanted it to be ordained by both, they wanted to be governed by both ordained and non-ordained or lay people. So that was kind of their main sticking point. They didn't just want ordained people making church decisions. They wanted it to be a mixture of both. Whereas our folks, the Puritans, also known as the Congregationalists, that's what they called themselves. They didn't call themselves Puritans. They called themselves Congregationalists. They rejected all national church governance. They did not believe that the church should be governed by a nation, like a specific nation, but that it should be basically run by small groups of self-governing worshipers. So this is, when you think about religion in America today, this is much, much more like what many of the religious denominations that we see in the United States are like. And we have, I guess, the Puritans to thank for that. They believed that rather than having ordained priests running the show, bishops and all that kind of thing, instead ministers, deacons, and elders would be selected by the community that they were, overseeing. So it's actually a much more democratic way of running a church, and that's going to be, of course, important, setting a precedent for the democracy that would come later. There's definitely going to be a hierarchy. Don't get me wrong. Don't get it twisted. The Puritans were very authoritarian and hierarchical, but in terms of religion, this was a pretty radical departure. So, after Queen Elizabeth died, the Low Church faction, that's our, Congregationalists and Protestants, became stronger without her there to kind of keep a lid on things. And this led to the High Church, kind of the more status quo traditional types, including King James I, who came after Elizabeth, and then his successor, Charles I. There's a whole thing there. They actively started trying to suppress the Low Church members. So, Puritans, basically. They were silenced when they tried to talk about their religious beliefs and share and spread their religious beliefs. They were actually physically removed from their churches when they were having meetings. They were kept from employment as a way to punish them, basically. And in some cases were even imprisoned for speaking out and trying to spread the word about their beliefs. So not only are they dealing with that, but the context of the time in terms of like the social order was just crazy. There was a civil war that happened, and that always makes for a very difficult life, trying to live through something like that. So that led to the regicide, the killing of Charles I. Okay, so that was the second guy with the pictures, the three pictures I just showed you, the one right after Elizabeth, who succeeded from him. He was killed, and Oliver Cromwell, created what was called the Protectorate. He was not the king. It was more of kind of a parliamentary thing. I'm not going to get super into it, but one thing I wanted to point out, when y'all are reading William Bradford's A Plymouth Plantation, there is a whole chapter dedicated to this guy named Thomas Morton of Merrymount, and it's probably, I think, the best part of the whole reading. It's fantastic. This guy, Thomas Morton, he is a total rebel, and he completely breaks away from the Puritans, and he drives them nuts. And it's kind of hilarious. But one of the things they threaten him with is that they're going to totally tattle on. He's doing all kinds of stuff they don't like, including selling guns to the natives, which they are pretty irritated about. They threaten to tattle on him to the king, and then he basically responds with, "The king is dead, so I don't care." So this is exactly what he's talking about. Charles I was killed, and so Thomas Morton of Merrymount was like, "All right, it's time to get you know, I could do whatever I want now, for real. So please enjoy that chapter. It's, I think, pretty interesting. And then, okay, after Cromwell was taken out of power, they reestablished the monarchy. So it's just like, that's when we get James the First, and he didn't like the neither Charles nor James liked the Puritans. And for James, it was really more about he was a good friend of the Quakers, and the Puritans were jerks to the Quakers in the colonies. But we'll get to that later. Turns out they didn't like being persecuted, but they had no problem with persecuting others. Isn't that always the way? So it's just like back and forth craziness, just exhausting for everybody. Not only that, but there's serious economic problems happening too, and that just makes everything so much worse. So between 1530 and 1680, the population of England literally doubled. Okay? So that's going to put a massive, massive strain on everything resource-wise. Okay? There are fewer goods to go around, right? So because of that, you know, we all know how the economics of that works. Because there's less to go around, the prices are going to skyrocket. And there are more people, but not enough jobs for all those people to fill. So for that reason, employers could pay way less and wages just go down. So prices go up, wages go down, and it's just like we've got lots and lots of really poor people now. And so the wealthy, as they tend to do, see this giant teeming mass of lower class people. They're vastly outnumbered. And so they fear revolution, basically, that they're going to take their stuff. So social tensions were running super high at the time. So the Pilgrims decided to get out of Dodge. Okay. Some of them went to the Netherlands in 1606, and that didn't last too long because they were only sort of welcomed, and also they were worried that their future generations, their children, were going to become too Dutch, I guess. They were worried about kind of assimilating too much, and that the Puritans worked really, really hard to maintain purity as a group, so that didn't work for them. So instead, in 1620, the group sailed to what we know as the New World on the Mayflower, and this is the Pilgrims, right, that we know today. All right. So, funny story. Well, it's not funny to them, but and this is important to understand when you're reading Bradford's The Plymouth Plantation, so you can understand why he would spend so much time trying to keep everyone from going, freaking out, for lack of a better phrase. There was a huge mistake made. They'd already been on a boat for a really long time, and there was a lot of illness and all kinds of, difficulties. And then they get there to the English colonies, and they had been given permission by the king, in this case James, to settle in Virginia. No, sorry, Charles. To settle in Virginia. Okay, they were given that permission because he didn't want them around. So he's like, okay, fine, go to Virginia. And Virginia at that time was any English land south of New York and north of Florida. It was a huge territory, okay? But the captain of the Mayflower missed the coast from New York to Florida, and they landed in Massachusetts. Oopsie daisies, right? That's a pretty big miss there. So this is a place they had no permission to be. Did not have the established colony infrastructure that they were expecting to be waiting there for them when they showed up. So everything is pretty wild and woolly. Okay, it's so for that reason they felt they needed to establish some laws among themselves as a group, and fast. Otherwise, things were going to completely descend into chaos, and it was going to be a huge disaster. So this is where we get the Mayflower Compact, and y'all are going to read that as part of the Bradford reading, and it's really important that you pay attention to what the compact talks about. This was pretty important. So, like I said, William Bradford, author of Plymouth Plantation, which is kind of a journal of their history. He was the leader of the group, and he was the facilitator of the compact and the one who wrote the history later. So what to know about the compact? It is the first governing document of the colony. It was written, of course, by the male passengers of the Mayflower. Nobody, wanted to hear from the ladies. Sorry, ladies. And so this is are a group of separatist Congregationalists who called themselves saints. So our Puritan folks, they did call themselves saints. There were lots of other people on that boat, and they were adventurers and tradesmen. And so you get a lot of William Bradford talking about their behavior and about the Puritans just being totally disgusted by their behavior. And so they refer to those people as strangers. So they all landed in the same place, but the Puritans very quickly set about to othering, and that's going to go much further and as they go along. It's a big part of their cultural formation. This is who we are, and this is who everyone else is, and here's what makes us God's elect. Okay, so the Puritans in the New World. They modeled their society on European values, even though they were leaving Europe, but I mean, that's what they knew. That's if we all got into a rocket ship and went to Mars, and everyone on that rocket ship is American, then if we get there and we have to start a whole new colony, chances are good we're going to kind of lean on the values that we already understand and know. And they may change over time. I mean, it's inevitable. They probably will. But that's almost certainly where we'd start. We wouldn't model it off of, like, I don't know, some other country's values, because we probably wouldn't know about those. So the Puritans were an intensely patriarchal society, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. They also believed themselves to be in a covenant or an agreement with God, and that's something that Bradford talks about a lot in the Mayflower Compact. They believed that they were the chosen ones, chosen by God to go be his representatives in the New World. They called this land New Canaan, also known as the Promised Land. They compared themselves to the Israelites of the Old Testament. So there's going to be a lot of Old Testament scriptural references in these readings. And it's not a bad idea to actually look them up if you can while you're reading, because it adds just a lot of context to what they're talking about. Everybody would have known the references, but if you don't, it's kind of hard to understand what they're talking about. So, sorry, I keep bumping the mic here. They followed an Old Testament model of patriarchal community, which meant that man was at the head of everything, the church, the nation state, and also the household as well. So not terribly progressive, actually more regressive in that way. Okay, so this idea of the covenant with God, okay, this philosophy. So they firmly believed that God chose them to come to America, that they needed to uphold their end of that agreement and to act as a city, what they call the city upon a hill, and that's something that Bradford talks about as well. They needed to be a shining beacon for the rest of the world to look at and be like, this is what God wants us to be like, right? Model after that. So they basically structured their community on this idea of mutual consent of those so governed, meaning that people needed to agree to be governed, that it was a contract. Okay, this gave a common sense of purpose in that they needed to succeed as a community and they needed to survive as a community, and so they needed to have interdependence of members. People couldn't just be out for themselves. They had to work together, like, all the time and share what they had and, like, be one body. So that's something that Bradford talks about a lot, like that we are of one body, and if the moment we pull apart from each other, the moment we try to go out for ourselves, it's like losing a hand or losing an eye or something like that. So pay attention to the language he uses there. This meant, though, that in order to have that sense of cohesion as a group, they needed total uniformity in terms of belief and practice in everything they did. And so for that reason, any kind of dissent in terms of arguing against or critiquing the governing church elders or the dominant philosophy, going against what they're establishing as the status quo, needed to be just stamped out immediately and fairly ruthlessly. So we're going to talk more about that later. All right, and that's where we're going to pause for this segment.